welcome and thank you so much for tuning into the Psychology Is podcast. I am your host, Nick Fortino. I'm joined by a very special guest today, which I will introduce in a moment. I just want to make the quick announcement to our audience. Anyone who wants to support us through Patreon, you can follow the link, which is just patreon.com/psychologyis. And what you'll get by becoming a patron is ad-free, early access, full-length videos, and the satisfaction of knowing you're supporting good people. So hopefully people join us and support us in that way. This is our 53rd episode of the Psychology Is podcast, and one of our most special guests because Dr. Eric FitzMedrud was a teacher of mine in graduate school. So thank you so much for joining me, Eric.
I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Yeah. So there was a couple courses that you taught that were probably some of the most important courses of my graduate school experience, which were critical thinking and then scholarly writing. And then I also went on to be your TA for those courses as well. So I felt like in that period of time, I had the chance to spend a lot of time with you and learn a lot from you. And it's very exciting that you've written a book called The Better Man. And that is exactly what we are here to explore in depth. I've read this book and there's so much extremely valuable insight, and just I recommend it highly. We are recording this here in the beginning of August. Can you let us know when will the book become available to the public?
So it's available for pre-order now, and it will release on September 19th.
Exciting. 2023.
Correct.
If anyone is watching this far from now. Let me say a little bit more about who you are. Dr. FitzMedrud is a clinical psychologist working as a therapist who specializes in relationships and sexual issues, and specializes further in helping men improve their sex lives by learning to regulate their emotions, removing sexual entitlements, and improving their consent and negotiation skills.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that is certainly a need in this world. There's a lot of things you say about consent that reminds us that it's not as simple as it may sound. And it's not like someone says yes once and there we go, we're good to go from here on out.
Right. I think there's a real risk when we talk about the need to get consent, that the message to men is get your partner's consent. That leaves aside the consent is for men too. Consent is for every partner in any experience. And it also kind of focuses us on the scripts. What do I say? How do I do it? As if that lockstep process is really the total of the experience, whereas there are deep internal self-awarenesses we need in order to know what we're asking for, in order to stay in tune with how we feel about the process while we're engaging with our partner, in order to stay attuned to them, in order to take a no and celebrate a yes with a certain degree of equanimity for both, so that we can stay present to what is happening now. And so I really spend the vast majority of the book helping readers develop those other self-knowledge, emotional self-regulation, communication tools that build the foundation for consent conversations, so that by the time I get to teaching the consent conversations in the book, it's a multidimensional process. We're talking about a whole person engaging in consent conversations, not just the script running the show.
And perhaps it goes without saying, but the reason that this is so important is because we have, trauma on the line consent violations are traumatic. And so there's even one part in the book where you raise that question that many people might have, which is like, does seeking consent potentially like interrupt the flow of a progressing sexual encounter? And on one hand, you say, no, it doesn't have to. There are ways that you can kind of weave it in seamlessly and even in a way veil the consent seeking through like dirty talk and things like that. But on the other hand, also, as you acknowledge, okay, even if it does interrupt the flow,
yeah,
it's worthwhile. Given
absolutely. The cost benefit here of, would you rather risk interrupting the flow and causing your partner trauma, or risk interrupting the flow and not causing that trauma? It's kind of a no-brainer when we put it into those terms. And I just want to say, I mean, yes, trauma is on the line. That's the risk, the vulnerability, the pain in our relationships, disrupted or broken connections with people that we're sexually attracted to and interested in, and whom we want to be interested in us. But on the flip side of it, consent is the foundation of pleasure. So the same conversations that we're having to prevent pain, when they're going well, when we get really proficient in them, when we can blend them with a little bit of seductive, hot, dirty talk, something like that, now we get to move towards pleasure. And the further we move towards pleasure for both partners, the further away from those risks we're getting. It's a simultaneous process. It's not just, prevent negatives. It's move towards the good stuff.
Such an important point. Yes. That skillful consent practices actually help maximize pleasure.
Yeah, it's essential.
Well, before we kind of dive into what consent looks like and how to skillfully practice it, let's talk about the cultural context that you lay out in the beginning of your book. You talk about what is essentially a patriarchal society that has in many ways misled and even wounded men and given men a sense of entitlement, which leads to controlling behaviors and performance demands and all kinds of romantic myths that we think we have to live up to. So can you just kind of paint this picture of the cultural context and how it has given rise to problems?
Sure. I mean, I think I want to make sure, as we're talking about this too, we're not just talking, when we talk about the patriarchy, we're not just talking about something that has entitled and benefited men. We're also talking about something that takes a lot away from men and other people. And so I'm really trying to balance out, yes, there are certain places where the patriarchal contract is, if you are successful, if you have property, if you have income at a certain level, then you will be a man who's put into positions of power and respect and seen as some degree of an ideal. But for all men, whether you're at that high end of achievement and acknowledgement of the patriarchal pyramid or not, that contract comes with a preemptive, clause that says, in order to have this possibility, you need to cut yourself off from your emotions. You need to wall yourself off from vulnerability. You need to not look like or be perceived as homosexual. Even if you are homosexual, the best homosexual in this notion is somebody who looks as much like a straight man as possible. And so there are all of these different ways that patriarchy is also forcing men into a box, and even men whose personality, whose authentic gifts in the world might strongly conform to patriarchal notions of what masculinity is. An entrepreneur who works on cars in his spare time and, is kind of stoic and loves playing sports. Hey, that's great. That's a beautiful kind of man in the world. And at some point, he will age, he will get ill, he will have emotional pains like his parents dying or his dog passing away. And it will be vital and important for him to understand that he was always a more multidimensional human being than the patriarchal box put him in. Mark Green calls it the man box. I think you had another guest on your show previously who talked about the academic term of the gender role strain paradigm. There are other authors who call it constrained masculinity, and sometimes it's called toxic masculinity. But what we're talking about is that narrowness that defines what we can be, a less than three-dimensional human. And that is what we're allowed.
I like the term you use too, destructive masculinity. Yeah, that I like that. I'll even read something that you wrote at the end of the first chapter in the book. You write, underneath the experiences of your trauma, probably interrupted at a time before you even have memory, there's a man that you could have been if you hadn't been hurt and isolated. He knew how to be touched, how to love, how to be vulnerable, how to be a heart friend to other people. And he had the capacity to become a kind and generous lover. That man is still there inside of you. And this book is intended to help you move closer to being him.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not a finger wagging book towards men. This is a book that recognizes that our gifts, our capacities have been interrupted, and I'm trying to offer them back to the reader, to reclaim them, to reintegrate them, to not let that be the end of the story, essentially.
Even though I think you've stated it, can you state it again or in another way? Exactly what capacities do you believe have been most commonly interrupted in men?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it really concretely in terms of just the connection to and access to our own bodies, the seat of our emotions where they all take place. Very often, our experiences of being told, don't dance because that looks less than manly, or don't cry because if you cry, somebody is going to or has hurt you emotionally or physically. So we get cut off from ourselves, from our own embodied experience in order to try to stay safer. And that hurts us first. I mean, this is the bell hooks quote, right? The first wound, the first sacrifice the patriarchy demands of men is that they sacrifice their own connection to their emotions. I'm sure that I've paraphrased that badly, but that's the gist of it. That this is a really important part, which is why so often when men are asked by their partners, male or of any other, female or of any gender, what are you feeling? What are you thinking about our relationship? So often we experience this blank moment. We haven't developed and nurtured, we have stopped the attentional capacity to notice our own experience.
In your experience as a therapist, working with so many men who've had this experience, do you find that significant improvement can be made?
Oh, yeah, without question. I mean, the book is essentially the developmental process, beginning in the early chapters of what I would do with different men in different ways in my office. I mean, it's important that we begin by recognizing our wounds, that we remember that we are valuable, reclaim some sense of our own worth, that we fill in some of the gaps in our education about sexuality and desire, that we shed the processes or the mindset of entitlement, that we rebuild our own autonomy to take care of ourselves, and that we return to a capacity to regulate our emotions and to communicate those to others.
Another thing you say, you talk about who this book is for.
Mm-hmm.
And you emphasize, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here to find the
No
exact,
worries.
but basically you emphasize that this book is for men who want to live a life of integrity when it comes to their sexual desires.
Yeah.
And I love that. You're very clear. Like, if you find pleasure in violating consent, this book is not for you. This is not what this is about.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same boundary that I draw in my practice. I don't work with clients who engage in or enjoy consent violations. That's a different clinical specialty for people with, forensic practices when the legal system is likely to become involved. The consent violations that I do work with are the kinds of non-predatory, unintended. I don't know how to navigate a consent process. I don't know how to regulate my own desire. And because of that, unintentionally and to my own pain, I have hurt my partners and behaved in ways that I don't agree with, aren't in line with my values, and that I don't want to continue behaving in anymore. And so that process of identifying that's who the book is for is very important, I think, because these tools address that pain, that kind of, I don't like what I just did there. I don't like the outcome of that process. I don't like that my partner feels bad. I didn't intend it. I was even trying actively to prevent that harm, and I missed, and I don't like that. So there's a recognition in there that for the vast majority of men, we have an aspiration to something better, something more loving, more nurturing, more connected. We want our partners to feel joy and pleasure with us. And I'm really trying to give tools wherever a man is coming into that journey that will help him continue it.
Yes. One of the things you point out is that, part of our conditioning is that if I'm a man, I already know what to do in the sexual realm. I'm already competent. I shouldn't need her to tell me what she wants. I should know what to do. I should perform well, which kind of runs counter to this whole concept of like learning how to negotiate all of this.
And it runs counter to the fact that you don't know what's going on inside of your partner. You can't know what's going on inside of your partner. There is no, one size fits all recommendation for how to please your lover, for how to make a woman orgasm, for how to make your partner, fall in love with you fast, because humans are too varied. And so any tool that you've learned with a prior lover may not be applicable to this lover. Anything that you might be inclined to naturally that might really connect with one partner may not connect with the next one. And so, it's not just this thing that we've been taught as men, but it's also the message that our partners often will bring to our relationships with us. You're not confident. You aren't saying what should happen here. Well, there's a reason for that. I don't know what you need. As we develop our relationships with each other, an explicit and engaged and monitored and iterative consent process goes so far to help us develop the specific and unique map needed between these two people to make that erotic connection happen and to keep it vibrant and intense. And so there's a discovery process all the time.
Well said. Makes perfect sense. And this is all happening while fueled by some of the most intense feelings a person can feel.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make it easy necessarily. I mean, in that, when I say that, I'm thinking of passionate sexual desire and attraction. I'm also thinking of even the emotions that you talk about in chapter 6 of your book, of anger and jealousy and rejection and disappointment and sadness and frustration. In the realm of sex, in my experience, and I'm sure in many men's experiences, the feelings are so intense, and that makes it difficult to regulate and to channel appropriately. So, that's another reason that I think this is such a valuable contribution that you've made. because it's a genuinely difficult realm to navigate successfully.
It really is. And recognizing how difficult it is, we need support for navigating it. We need to understand, what is the nature of desire? Why does desire frustrated lead to anger? Why is it that when we're actually moving closer to what we hoped for in a sexual encounter, why is that one of the riskiest moments, when our desire starts to intensify and our focus begins to narrow, and when we begin to kind of move closer to our goal? As my hope is that by mapping the nature of desire, by mapping different ways of managing our emotions and our intensity, our great, beautiful, vibrant intensity, it will empower men to more skillfully bring the gifts of our intense and, life-giving, erotic drive to the world. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And also sometimes a little bit perilous, like a lot of intense things.
Right. Like a potent fuel source that could start a destructive fire or do a lot of good.
Yeah.
So let's lean into this, sexual desire, that question that you raised, like, of can my sexuality be good? And I love the framework that you consistently put around male sexuality, that it is beautiful, like you just said, that your sexual feelings and behaviors are a gift that you can give. So that in itself, I think, is very helpful, and probably a shift in the way that we often think about our desires, because, like you said, also, we are made to demonize our sexual desires quite often, and that's exactly antithetical to what you're saying now, that our sexual desire can actually be this beautiful gift that we give. I suppose we just have to learn how to gift it. But let's
gift it, and how to find the right partners who want to receive that gift.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Well, that actually kind of leads to my first question about sexual desire. Okay, so sexual desire and sexual shame, I want to bring both of those up right now, because often we feel ashamed for what we desire, or for how we're expressing our desires, and what kinds of desires are okay. So maybe I'll just first let you speak to, like, the nature of male sexual desire, and then I'll ask a couple follow-up questions if that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that I want to name in here. One of the core principles that I have is that men are vastly diverse. And so when we talk about the nature of male sexuality, I always like to acknowledge that there is a vast diversity inside of it. We seem to have, if there are some generalizable qualities among us, including among us, we seem to have capacities for intensity. We seem to have a little more spontaneous desire that arises without some other specific stimulus. It just seems to come up inside of us. We seem to have some creativity to it, including kinks or oddities, or things that have may not have been thought of before. And let me try this. Let me be interested in that. Ooh, I haven't seen that before. What is that? There's a curiosity. Not all men have that experience. Some men have low desires. Some men have very specific, narrow desires. All of that's possible, right? There's a wide range in here. But what is a common experience for many men is that messages like men are pigs, men are dogs, men only want one thing, men only have one thing on their mind, be careful of men because they'll take advantage of you, is that there's this automatic layer on top of our sexuality in our own minds that the inherent arising of our desire is bad. And that's where shame begins to enter into the picture, that it's not about what I've done. It's not about what I'm doing. It's not about what I actually want to enact, just the internal experience of my own sexual desire, my fantasies, my thoughts, something that occurred to me once, that those things make me bad. And that serves to divide us from our human communities. It serves to divide us from our own eroticism, and forces us often to try to present a picture of our erotic lives that are different from the truth in order for us to, well, what we hope is that that will allow us to gain real relationship. But then we're participating in our relationships from behind an inauthentic veil. And that prevents us from entering into real relationship and deep eroticism.
And one of the questions that was occurring to me as I was reading about, about sexual desire and sexual shame is, what about when a man's desires are shameful? Now, I have to be very careful about describing a desire as shameful because we see how that's problematic. But perhaps if it's objectively not okay.
Yeah, can I jump in? Because like this is something that in my field we talk about to a fair degree. So there are a lot of desires that any one person could have that don't fit with inside of our values. They don't fit with inside of the relationship agreements that we have. The desires, the fantasies, the flashes of thought or impulse that we might have may not fit inside of the legal system. But we don't choose what piques our desire. Our desires are developed inside of us as we develop our erotic lives. Maybe we witness a movie that was never intended to be something that we would connect to, and yet we did. Maybe we encounter a restricted availability of sexual information or sexual access, but we're able to look at something surreptitiously one time, and that causes a little spark. We didn't choose these moments of our erotic landscape getting formed. And so what I like to talk about is that the desire itself, internal, known only by you in the privacy of your own mind, doesn't have a moral component to it. You didn't choose it, and you aren't enacting it as long as it's still in your mind. And so there are people, for example, who specialize in working with men whose desires are outside of legal capacities, outside of whatever should be, regardless of what is legal, outside of what's permissible in moral behavior. And that desire came to him wasn't his choice. So I think it's really valuable to just recognize that the internal thought, the fantasy, the impulse, that's a neutral experience. For example, people with OCD will have this experience often. Graphic, violent, intrusive images that come into their minds. This has really nothing to do with the moral quality of that human being. It's a part of the human experience. And it's just really important to recognize the difference between a thought and your behavior.
Mm. This leads me to want to read another quote.
Okay.
If you were about to say something else, please don't.
Go for it.
But this might have been one of my favorite lines from the whole book, honestly.
Oh, great.
So you wrote on speaking to how to regulate your desire. You say, in my experience, most men do not know how to regulate anything more than their mouths and their hands. Most men don't know that they need to regulate the content of their mind and their attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go into, 6 skills for regulating sexual attention, which include And I know we won't have time to go deep into all of them, but I'll just mention them.
Yeah.
The cultivating appreciation, shifting the focus, meeting your needs, falling in love skillfully, and holding your desire accountable. So can you speak to that line specifically about how men need to know that they need to regulate the content of their mind and their attention?
So we've all probably had this experience of somebody in our lives talking about a man as creepy or smarmy, or it just kind of feels icky being around him. For many of us men, we might have also had that experience around another man. And what I'm talking about here is that if you're sitting around and leering, cultivating fantasies with somebody at work, or somebody that is the friend of your partner or something like that, you very well might end up creating during that experience. People have subtle intuitive cues that somebody's aroused, right? Pupil dilation, skin getting flushed, a particular way that we look or glance that's different than we normally do. These things are detected in intuitive ways because we are all experts at a certain level in other human beings. And so I'm not saying that any particular fantasy itself is a problem, and yet there are times and places to fantasize even, because as we cultivate our internal experience when we're around another person, that can be beneficial, connecting, interpersonal, humane, and mindful. Or we can be performing the conversation from behind the glass of our own eyes, while we cultivate desires and fantasies and videos in our mind that might really actually distance us greatly from the human community around us.
And when you talk about cultivating these fantasies, that's interesting, because I wonder, like, let's take, the hypothetical example of, an older man who's finding himself attracted to like teenage girls, right? It's very believable, and we don't have to pretend that a young woman suddenly becomes visible on her 18th birthday, but when she was 17, we didn't notice that she was pretty. So I think for many men, this is difficult to even acknowledge, let alone talk about, that they might have these types of attractions, or like you said, the example of, your partner's friend or your coworker or anyone with whom it would be inappropriate to be sexual. So my question is, like you said, the fact that the desire arose is not the man's fault. But at that point, what responsibility does he have within his own mind to kind of either fuel that fantasy or not fuel that fantasy? And what might be the repercussions to him, for example, masturbating to his daughter's friend or something like that? Like, what is that immoral, and could that lead to creepy behavior, even on the level of just glancing at, girls' butts or something like that?
So, I think that what we're talking about is the cultivation. So there are certain elements that the content of our mind is under our control consciously, and there are certain elements that it isn't. What I'm talking about is that we have a capacity to respond to the spontaneous things that arise in our mind, to pay more attention to them, and to allow that to filter into behavior, conscious or unconscious, where we have the capacity to turn our attention to other things. I want to be clear that as a therapist, I don't like to use moral frameworks as often. I'm much more inclined to use health-oriented frameworks. I have one of those in the book that I refer to, and that is where I would go with any specific person around the kinds of thoughts that you're talking about. And rather than trying to kind of offer any kind of blank slate impression of this, I think I really want to be careful, because one person as you said, masturbating to, mental images of a person that would be inappropriate for them to enact that with, might not have any problem with that, and somebody else would. So when we talk about sexual health in the communities around the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, we talk about each person's path to health and what that looks like, which behaviors do and don't work for that person, for them to keep their behaviors in line with their sexual values and with their other values, including whatever moral values they might be bringing to it. It's not for a therapist to step in and to make a determination, this is moral and that is not moral. And if we do, then we become the voices of shame and repression. And number one, we risk people will stop seeing us to gain assistance for whatever erotic conflicts they might be engaged in. But also we risk that we take our own notions, for example, what worked for me, and I start rubber stamping that onto my clients, oppressing them with notions of health or restriction that did work for me or didn't work for me, that wouldn't be sustainable, appropriate, and authentic for that client. So, I think if somebody's having attractions, especially unwanted attractions to minors, that's something really to pursue with a sex therapist and or a forensic psychologist, because you might need help with that.
Yeah.
And that help needs to be individualized to your experience.
Mm. Let's take the example of something that would not be, and again, not to impose a moral framework on it necessarily, but something that would not be as morally reprehensible, like maybe a fantasy about your wife's friend, let's say, and you're in a monogamous relationship. So it's like, it's a different level of morality, I think, in the eyes of society when you're talking about that compared to minors. And so I guess the question I really am curious about is, if a person leans into that fantasy, cultivates that fantasy, masturbates to that mental imagery, and yet it is not aligned with their own morality, they don't want to carry out those behaviors. My question is, if a person were to feel that fantasy, does that end up spilling over into behavior in unintended ways through attention, through communication, and any kind of overt behavior?
So I don't want to just issue a no, because for a person who has difficulty making the distinction between their fantasy and their real behavior, for a particular person who has difficulty with impulse control or a sense of entitlement, that bleed over from cultivating the fantasy into their behavior could occur. And the general take on fantasies is that fantasies are not reality, and that plenty of people all the time have fantasies of things that turn them on in their minds, or that they would like to read about, or that they might like to watch videos about, that are performances, not reality, that do not actually lead to any behavior, because that person doesn't have problem making distinction between fantasy and reality, impulse control, and they don't have a sense of sexual entitlement that because I desire this, somebody else will want to or must engage in it with me. So I can give an example that I often use from Justin Lehmiller's book, Tell Me What You Want. He examines all sorts of different fantasies, why people have them, et cetera. And one of the examples that he gives is that for women, a fairly common fantasy is, and this is could be a trigger for some of the listeners, so I'll just offer a gentle caveat here. What I'm going to talk about is an intense, violent experience. So what he talks about there is that some women have rape fantasies, or like reading rape erotica, that this is a very common, according to the research, fantasy. But that doesn't mean any of those women at all, anywhere, anytime, anyhow, under any circumstance, actually want that experience to take place. Fantasies are different than the desires that we want to enact.
which is probably helpful for some people to hear if they're experiencing shame around those fantasies and around what they kind of are internally aroused by. When I hear you speaking, I hear a certain level of, permission that you're granting. Not that you think you're the one to be granting permission, but there's a sense of permission that comes with this message here that says that what I hear is you don't have to be ashamed for the images that arise in your mind. And it's not necessarily what we're held accountable for morally. And so there need not be shame around that.
Yeah, it's a normalization that the content of your mind is not the content of your behavior. If we just take it out of the sexual realm for a quick second, most people will recognize who hasn't on a frustrating day at work had thoughts of, throwing their papers in the air, flipping their boss off, saying something crass and walking out the front door. We all have impulses at times that we don't actually want to enact. It expresses some aspect of our internal experience, but that doesn't mean that that's who we are or what we're going to do. Right.
And although like you said, you can't just issue a blanket no to this question, but I suppose it's also fair to say that a person doesn't necessarily need to worry that they're going to lose control of their behavior, that their behavior is going to become just as spontaneous and out of nowhere as some of the content of their mind.
It's a very common fear for people with OCD that the content of my mind means that I'm at risk of enacting this behavior. And as a therapist, I would typically begin by asking a couple of questions. Have you ever acted on this? Have you ever done anything like this? Have you ever had an impulse control issue? If you have, we now have a totally different conversation than we do if the client answers no to all of those questions.
And perhaps we can say a little bit more about sexual shame, and I think you do just such a good job talking about that. And I like a distinction that you draw in the book between secrecy and privacy, and because I think maybe you say this, or maybe I'm just pulling this from other sources, but that whenever we find ourselves hiding our behaviors, that's a signal that there might be shame around that. And yet that doesn't mean that certain things are not meant to be totally private. So how can one discern whether they're just being private or secretive?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. I mean, part of what you're alluding to is the honesty principle in the sexual health principles and my discussion around that. So the principle around honesty, as I talk about it, is, hey, not everybody that you meet needs to know everything about your erotic life, right? Your barista not only doesn't care about your sexuality, doesn't want to know about it, don't tell them about that. And when we're in a romantic relationship with somebody, we engage in some degree of sharing of our internal erotic lives with each other. And doing so is one of the pathways to create a vibrant erotic connection in a couple. And there might be some elements of your erotic life that you would like to keep private. Many men who are partnered still masturbate. When I say private, that might mean he wants to masturbate alone because that's his own process about himself and his own body. And I think the distinction between hiding and privacy is, does your partner know that you masturbate? If they don't know that you masturbate, if that's not necessarily a problem. They might kind of shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, I kind of figured most men do, and not have any issue with it. And on the other hand, especially for clients with conservative cultural or religious backgrounds, not sharing some of this information can lead to a sense of violation, that not just that the behavior was taking place, but that the behavior was hidden. And there's another principle that we talk about sometimes in our work around sexuality, like your genitals only belong to one person, and that's you, not to your partner. And yet there are often assumptions about it. And whether those assumptions are right or wrong, having those assumptions violated can create feelings of betrayal that can break relationship. And so we have to be very careful about which elements of our internal erotic lives we are keeping to ourselves, which ones we are sharing the fact of with our partner, and which ones we are sharing live with our partner, because that's a big part of how we enter into relationships, enter into relationship agreements about where the bounds of fidelity are around this relationship, and a big part of how we maintain our relationships and prevent them from unexpected harm. And
there's a big difference clearly between what this kind of communication looks like and what consent looks like, depending on the nature of the relationship, depending on whether it's a long-term relationship or not. And I love the metaphor you use, which perhaps you can illustrate now, about the consent castle.
Sure. So this comes from Everyday Feminism, which is a web comic, and it's one of my favorite metaphors for consent. So this isn't mine, and I've got a citation to it in a book. You can look it up online. But the consent castle is this idea that in the beginning of a relationship, you are building the structures, the routines of your shared sexual life with this person. That requires hard hats and safety vests and safety protocols, identifying where the danger zones of this developing building, this developing structure are for you. As the relationship extends from short-term, new, novel, into the kind of repertoire that this couple has, you get comfortable. I know how you like to be touched. You know how I like to be touched. You know how I don't like to be touched, and vice versa. We begin to feel safer inside of this consent castle that we've built together. We don't necessarily need to engage in explicit verbal consent processes every time. We have built some experiences with each other that we can now maybe use to improvise with quick verbal inquiries, eye movements, moments in process of just like, hey, do you want to today? And that's already, well-trodden territory. It's like, do you want to go into the game room? Sure, we can go into the game room. Hey, do you want to watch a movie in the parlor? Sure, we can watch a movie in the parlor. And even for that long-term couple, if you want to add on to this consent castle, you want to build a sauna, you want to build an atrium, you want to build a solarium, you need to make that a construction zone. And that might affect parts of the existing structure. It definitely means that you need to put your hard hat and your, safety vests back on and return back to the explicit consent processes that you might have used earlier in the relationship, so that you can navigate this new toy, this new kink practice, this new explicit exploration of a fantasy that you are interested in now trying to enact that I hadn't heard about before. All of those things require that we re-enter that safety-oriented process again. This is something that a lot of men mistake. There's sometimes a belief, once I've gotten access to your body, and notice how, property-oriented this is and how entitlement-oriented this belief system is. Once I've gotten access to your body this way, I can do other things with it that we haven't talked about. I've touched you there with this part of my body, so I could clearly touch you there with that part of my body. And that's just not true. We need to re-enter the consent-based process explicitly.
And this explicit consent is, of course, crucial for all new novel relationships and encounters. And, it's interesting to think, like, when I reflect on my own experiences, what consent has looked like, how I've been so certain that this person is consenting, because it hasn't always been verbal questions like, is this okay? And it always has been okay, I think, I trust, but that's not always, I don't always verbalize the question, and I'm not always hearing a verbal answer. Much of it is emotional. It's body language. It's fueled by passion. There's a clear enthusiasm. But let's just, imagine that that people are listening who don't find it intuitive to read these signals, So what can a man look for, and what should explicit consent processes look like?
So I think one of the best things that a man who knows that he's not as in tune with subtle emotional signals can do is to name that explicitly to his partner. And then to ask the partner, what would the signs be that you were not enjoying, that we had bumped into some line or limit for you, that something that you had agreed to was something you no longer want to agree to? Because backing up from, FitzMedrud's standard playbook, which doesn't exist, the real lived experience that he's going through with that partner is the authority in that experience. And then he gets to listen. So his partner says, oh, well, I have had situations in the past where I freeze and I stop moving and I just get really quiet. And it's important for him now to know himself well enough. Is that something that I'm going to detect? Or is it something I'm not going to detect? Is that a risk he's willing to take in the consent process? Is his partner willing to take that risk with him that he might not detect that? How do those two people navigate, for example, his difficulties detecting and the partner's difficulty expressing? This is a really important gap for that couple to fill so that they both make sure they create positive experiences for themselves. And at least initially in the consent-oriented conversation, they need to be focused on, am I getting my own yes here? Does this feel safe to me to engage? And so kind of explicitly, I've got a couple of questions in the book. Of course, what are we each going to do here? What are we each not going to do here? And how are we going to back up from those experiences to maintain consent throughout the process? But ultimately, this is not a lockstep, ABC. This is improvisational jazz that you have to engage with with each partner.
Yes, and I think about this sometimes just broadly as it relates to emotions and emotional expressiveness. I think of like two spectrums, and we're all somewhere on each of these spectrums. And one of the spectrums represents emotional expressiveness. We're on one end of the spectrum, the most demonstrative people among us that wear their heart on their sleeve and their face is very animated. And on the other end of the spectrum is a very stoic, inexpressive emotions. And then the other spectrum is how sensitive you are to reading other people's emotions. And so the people who are least sensitive to that might do well with someone who's most demonstrative. And the person who's most sensitive to reading emotions is most capable of reading the people whose signals are the most subtle. And so I think that just maps onto what you're saying about, consent and how enthusiastic and eager and engaged and desiring this person is in this moment. There's the subtle and the blatant expressions of it, and then there's the ability to read the subtle expressions of it.
As well as all of the cultural layers that get added onto that, right? What's expressive in one culture is not expressive in another, or what means A in one culture means something completely different in another culture. So there are a lot of different elements to consider. And that's why it's so important to make a strong, explicit, enthusiastic consent, especially early in a relationship or for a hookup. We have to compensate for all of the unknown gaps between us with explicit communication to scaffold, the infinite gulf between two, divided experiential processes, my experiential process and your experiential process.
Yes. You talk about and you create a erotic landscape chart.
Yes.
That I find useful and fun to think about.
Yeah.
And I have a question about it, but perhaps first you can describe it.
Sure.
I know it's not that easy to describe with no visual.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you could do a good job.
Okay, I appreciate it. So this is the idea of, I talk about and have already referred to it, right? That you have an erotic landscape. When I say that, most people kind of intuitively go, yeah, I do. There are things that turn me on. There are things that turn me off. There are different parts of the landscape. But I kind of concretize it into this metaphor of the river valley. And I'll talk about the lowest part of this riverbed is the first place where water would flow, and the last place where the water would go away if something began to interfere with my sense of connection to my sexuality. So for a lot of people, this isn't even explicitly sexual. It's things like our identities, my, sexual orientation is often a part of that lowest part of the riverbed, the essential element of who I am as a sexual being. Next, things like physical closeness, touch, holding hands, kissing are common. I want to be clear as I'm giving these examples, I'm not telling anybody else what's essential for them, right? I'm just giving examples of what I've seen commonly in my practice. Well, then what happens if that river is full and vibrant, if it's, thriving with rich water flow, sourced by tributaries, and it's a thriving ecosystem? These are the things that make you feel like, my sexuality right now is good. It's contributing to life in other parts of my experience. It doesn't feel diminished. It doesn't feel empty. It feels great. So, what are the things that are part of that? Is it fantasy? Is it self-pleasure? Are there certain positions that really get you going? Is there some kind of element of frequency or something like that that's a part of it for you? All of those are allowed as a part of the discussion. As we move up the river valley, then we get to what I call the area of seasonal flooding. Things that, I like that, but not too often. Like things that might be birthday or special occasion sexual events. Things that I can only do when, me and my partner have the house to ourselves and hours to really get into it. Then I talk about the plains, and this is the area where the river can nurture the plains, but it might take a little bit of irrigation effort. This is stuff that I'm curious about, maybe I'm willing to do for my partner, but maybe doesn't do it for me. I'm interested in it maybe, but I'm not sure if it really will be that pleasurable. It's stuff that takes a little bit of extra work to get the water flowing there, but it's doable. The next part of this river valley is the hills. And if the river got up to that place, there's a problem. These are the things that turn me off. I don't like those. I don't want water to go there really ever. And so this is kind of where I start to draw my line. And then the last category is even further beyond that. These are the things, the language I use in the book is gross out. It's actually a concept that came to me as a therapist from the kink community. They use the term squick, but that's a specialized term for that community, so not everybody knows it. So I went with a little more of a more recognizable term. And when we're grossed out by something, it's kind of like, not only does it turn us off, we probably don't want to hear about it. We don't want to see video of it. We don't want to read about it. And if our partner's into that, we may not even want to know. And so by taking a look at how you would fill in the exercise in your river valley, what that means for you physically, emotionally, relationally, and in terms of the meaning and purpose of your sexual behaviors, thoughts, or practices, including how you just present and walk in the world. If you're an asexual person, you still probably have a landscape here. But all of these things allow you to know yourself better, which is why I put it really early in the book, so that the reader can take time with this exercise, really begin to expand and explore, understand, hey, these are some of the things that I might want to ask for. Hey, these are some of the things that I feel vulnerable sharing. Hey, these are some of the things that my partner might not want to know, or that my partner needs to know, turn me off and really shut me down. That self-knowledge is one of the key components of this consent process.
It's really helpful. One comment that I'm, thinking is it's interesting because when I think about my sexuality, for example, that's one thing. And when I'm in it, when I'm actively being sexual, that's quite another.
Mm-hmm.
And I might not put something on the list as a turn on because I'm just thinking about it intellectually. But then in the moment, I'm like, wow, that's a huge turn on. I love that. So I think for me, in order to fill out this chart, which I have begun to do, it actually, I need to reflect on past experiences instead of thinking hypothetically.
Yes.
Because the hypothetical, it limits what I end up writing.
Yeah, and you might find that maybe the content doesn't matter as much as another element, right? If some people, in my experience, when people fill this exercise out, they're really inclined to start with positions. But positions or a specific sexual practice may not matter to you as much as safety. It might not matter to you as much as connection. Or if your partner is really eager, interested, and alive, that might be what does it for you. And you might find that things that you never thought would be pleasurable can suddenly be pleasurable because of the relational interpersonal context that's creating that pleasure. So I try really concretely to invite the readers to tune into these other dimensions of experience and not to get too focused on the physical, because a lot of our sexual experience isn't just happening with our bodies. It's happening emotionally, relationally. For some people would use the term spiritually.
And I appreciate that you depict sex in this multidimensional way and as a potential source of meaning in a person's life. I know that certainly is true for me. And I mean, I'm kind of feeling out like, how much does the audience want to hear about Nick's sexuality right now? But I'll just say, I'll just say that I think for me, one of the greatest turn-ons possible is just a really intense connection, which sometimes even takes the form of like eye contact, which is very intense. Like eye contact during sexual intercourse, that's about as connected as I can possibly feel sometimes. And so it's just to think beyond what is most physically pleasurable.
Right.
Think about, what makes this a deeper experience, a more well-rounded experience, a more multi-dimensional experience is valuable to me. And that's partly what I was thinking about as I began to reflect on my erotic landscape.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you find in your experience personally and working with people that all of this evolves through time? What level of stability do we tend to have in our eroticism, and to what degree does it fluctuate and evolve and change through time?
So I think it's a really good question. I think I always want to reference one of my mentors and a person that I was very touched to receive an endorsement from on my book. Doug Brown Harvey says, we don't do erotoectomies. And so when something has been a turn on or a fantasy or a point of arousal, we don't seem as therapists to be able to eliminate that from a person's erotic landscape. There seems to be a resonant charge that remains when somebody has had the experience of arousal or turn on relative to some practice, thought, fantasy. And when you were talking about the malleability, there is this plasticity, this capacity to learn. So a little bit of playfulness, a little bit of openness to new experience, a little bit of mindful attention to the physiological experience, and a beneficial emotional relational connection with the person that we're encountering something new with does seem to allow us to have some flexibility. And I want to be very clear, that flexibility is not infinite. So not everybody is capable of being turned on by XYZ. And what our capacity for flexibility can be is individual to each person, unknowable by a therapist. It's, not something we can know. All we can do if we're interested and open in exploring something new is find the right partner or try on our own in safe, careful ways, get mindful, get curious, get playful, and see what emerges for us. We may discover something new in the landscape, and it may be more perilous than we thought. We might find, hey, that's the cliff where my landscape ends.
Right.
And that thing is on the other side. And there's no shame about either of those experiences.
Right. And I imagine that that's when it becomes important to remember that part of consent is not just seeking your consent, but expressing my own consent, and
exactly,
perhaps planning, knowing how, like you said, that conversation that two people can have of like, how will you express no? How will I know that you're no longer consenting to this? Because there's the obvious and the subtle, and I would always want to catch the subtlest expression of non-consent.
Yes. And, I think this is why explicit and knows and explicit conversations, explicit methods of monitoring and verbally checking in can be so valuable. We can also get in our own way in this process, right? We're in the middle of some highly pleasurable, intense sexual act for our partner's benefit. And, they have an itch on a forearm for a moment. That is a moment of disconnection. And if we overread that, we can interrupt what otherwise was working. And we can easily draw in layers of self-consciousness. This is why I think explicit consent and boundary setting are so valuable. Even with a partner, if you could otherwise potentially read disconnections, because reading body language always includes interpretation. And so the explicit, clear statement of my experience is at least relies on somewhat shared definitions if we speak the same language. Even then, there's differences, right? Yeah. So we can minimize the risks of these gaps emerging by just using our words, right? The verbal exclamations of pleasure go a long way to confirm.
Right.
It's not just explicit statements of the no, it's explicit statements of the yes, even if it's more, yes. All of that stuff is good.
Right. Well, speaking, I feel like we've kind of, touched on desire and consent and circled around it a few times. And I have a couple more questions that I want to ask you about this. So one, regarding consent, one of the big questions that always comes up, and, I teach psychology in a community college. And so my students and I often have great conversations around this topic. And the question of alcohol is always comes up, because as we all know, explicitly or intuitively, consent implies that this person is in the state of mind to consent. And the question of whether consent is valid when a person is intoxicated is very interesting. And there's even the phenomenon that I've heard or I read in a human sexuality textbook described as post-refusal persistence, which is when typically a male is rejected, and then persists in pursuing the other person. And in the context of when there's alcohol involved, often what it looks like is at first she says no, and then she drinks more, and he pursues harder, and eventually she says yes, and she really does say yes, and she might even enthusiastically say yes, but it just feels very complicated ethically. So I would just love to hear your thoughts about the role of alcohol and how we can navigate consent when alcohol is involved.
Yeah. So, and you used a particular phrase in there I want to come back to. It's the question of whether the consent is valid. And I think that very specifically invokes a legal framework. And I want to recognize not to a degree, that is where I'm outside of my area of expertise. That is what I consider low bar consent. Mm-hmm. It's about not causing sexual assault or rape in a particular situation. And I'm really much more oriented to high bar consent. Consent that creates pleasure, is oriented towards enthusiastic consent. And from that framework, I'm going to answer your question. So the first thing is, I really think that anybody that's too drunk to drive a car is too drunk to consent. And the next thing is, I think that especially for new relationships and hookups, and I know that a lot of young people are going to not like this, but think about it for a quick second, right? I think that it's much safer and wiser to engage in a hookup and in new consensual sexual activity with a new partner when alcohol is not involved. You're engaging in a pleasurable, enjoyable, but somewhat, dangerous act. Not just around consent, but around STIs and unwanted pregnancy, HIV, your reputations, what's going to feel good. All of this stuff is important to stay mindful of and to learn. And I have a really concrete question that I ask some of my clients around this. I know that alcohol can help you warm up to the idea, help you get into your body a little bit. But if the person is incapable of having sex with you without having a drink, what is that telling you about their availability to that pleasure for you? What does that tell you about their presence of mind to their emotional and relational needs, to their presence in their body, to their comfort with saying yes? And is that something that's safe for you, whether you've had a drink or two or not? And so you wouldn't go rock climbing with one drink. So why would you have a first sexual encounter on one drink? After you've built the consent castle a little bit, right? You've developed some structures, a little bit of a repertoire. You know each other. There's trust. There's a degree of familiarity. You know which paths you're going to trod. Maybe a little bit of alcohol in that situation doesn't hurt. And same thing, right? No new tricks under that intoxication. All the safety, all the, sobriety, hard hat, safety gear, and re-engage in building something new.
That's wise counsel. Yes. The other thing I want to ask you is, as we've acknowledged, performance demands tend to be destructive, and we don't want our sense of masculinity, our sense of self to be tied up in, this pressure to perform. And with that said, I think any man listening wants to perform. I don't know how else to put it, except doesn't want to ejaculate within 10 seconds and wants to help their partner come to pleasure, So in a healthy way.
Yeah.
I imagine that this is something that comes up in working with clients, that part Absolutely. Of working with sexual issues is like feeling like they're falling short. And I mean, even just finishing fast, like premature ejaculation is such a widespread, extremely frustrating problem that does make many men feel less masculine. And I don't think that it necessarily should, but it often does. And so what kind of guidance would you offer men who are frustrated in this way?
So there's a lot in there. The first thing that I'm going to say, whether we're talking about difficulties getting or maintaining an erection, or whether we're talking about premature ejaculation, or whether we're talking about difficulty delivering pleasure and orgasm to your partner, the very best thing that you can do to help yourself with any of the emotional experiences you might have about that is to have a partner who's going to treat you with kindness, not shame you, and stay engaged with you in the process. Because all three of those problems would be exacerbated by a partner who is shaming, by a partner who is trying to tell you that you are less of a man, who is trying to tell you that you are a bad lover, or that whole process, any of those processes were your fault. Now, if we've already got a partner who's engaged, so there are different causes for all of those experiences. Erectile difficulties can be a medical issue, can be about circulation in the penis, can have a cardiovascular element, can be affected by diabetes, is highly affected by anxiety, and especially anxiety about not getting an erection, which becomes its own, vicious cycle. If the first time that a man loses an erection, if he can just shrug it off and say, that's unusual, the odds are that he won't have that experience again for quite some time because he probably didn't have that experience before. And on the other hand, if he gets in his own head about it, oh, what happened? Why did that happen? Is it going to happen again? I wonder if it's, oh no, I'm not erect yet. I think I might be having that experience again. Well, that's not a very sexy set of thoughts, is it? Premature ejaculation has a number of different causes that it can be anything from I don't feel emotionally safe to my partner to this is the most emotionally connected I've ever felt with a partner. And that adds a whole new intense layer of stimulation that I've never experienced. And this is why that's happening. There are a number of really simple techniques that I think I don't have time to describe, but a therapist skilled in working with sexual issues can often help in just a couple of sessions with premature ejaculation. And the big thing that I always recommend to my penis owning clients is if you're having difficulty providing pleasure to your partner with your penis, know a couple of things. Penetration in no body is inherently and biologically guaranteed to create orgasm. So penetration is much more often pleasure for the penis owner than it is for the partner receiving the penetration. And then also, I like to ask questions. Do you think lesbian cisgender women have pleasurable sex? When most people think about it, they go, well, yeah. And the research evidence, by the way, says that they have the most orgasms of all the different kind of heterosexual and homosexual combinations. So why do you think that is when there's no penis here? If you can decenter an erection, you have a mouth, you have fingers, you have a whole body, you have an emotional, relational being you can bring to your partner. You could hold your partner and give them sensual kisses while a toy provides the physiological stimulation. Your presence is more important. Your love, your connection is more important than anything that's happening with your body. And if you can accept and embrace that, you have your heart to give, your presence to give, and that will be received, and a good and loving partner for you will be able to receive it.
Beautiful. I know that we've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes here.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, just bring up two more topics if you have time for it. Do you have another 10 minutes or so? Okay.
I have lots of time.
Okay, beautiful. So the first topic I want to raise is porn. And you write a lot about it, and I guess there's a lot we could potentially talk about related to porn, right? And I guess one of my main questions about it, interestingly, is whether... So let me back up and just say this. I think that when a male or anybody has has the goal of developing a sexual relationship with somebody, often it can bring the best out of him. I think that men attempt to stay in better shape. They attempt to develop their social skills, their communication skills, and that often this is very fueled by the ultimate goal of having more sex. And that I don't think this is a bad thing. I think anything that drives us to be at our best and at our healthiest and at our most communicative is positive. And if the incentive is sex, so be it. And I wonder, and I've heard the take that when men become addicted to porn, but even just, consume a lot of porn, that it can detract from their motivation to seek sex and thereby detract from them kind of optimizing themselves. So I'm curious, like, what you think about that idea, that possibility, and any other reflections that you'd like to share about consuming pornography.
Okay, we're going to get into it for a few minutes. All right. Let me start with the idea of porn addiction. There is a lot of conversation in the popular culture taking the addiction framework and putting it onto sexual behaviors, masturbation, having sex with other people, and pornography viewing. The best research evidence and the best therapeutic practice takes into account a number of things that questions that colloquial use of addiction relative to sexual behavior. So, number one, even a person who isn't engaging in any sexual behaviors is still a sexual being. We can't eliminate sexuality from our inherent nature. And so, again, going back to that phrase from Doug Brown Harvey, we don't do erotoectomies. And so the notion of abstinence is much more than just a misnomer when it comes to sexuality. We are swimming in the lived experience of being a sexual being. This is different than the connection of physiological addiction, where the organism functions perfectly fine without an addictive substance. So addiction treatment is something that the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists has a statement out about. You can find it on their website. And it says that, there is no DSM-5 TR. That's the professional manual for diagnosis. That there's no diagnosis of sex addiction. And that an attempt to take addiction therapies and apply to sexuality seems misapplied and has a lot of risks and has done a lot of damage to a lot of people. So that term, even if we're going to use it kind of colloquially to refer to what does happen, which is sexual behaviors that feel out of control and that damage relationships, it's important to understand that we're using an approximation of that term, not the actual clinical description of addiction. And then, there are a lot of anecdotal conversations about this is what happened to me, and this is how it feels for me, this is what happens in my life. And then putting that out on a public stage, putting that out on social media as the phenomenon of like not masturbating for a month or eliminating porn viewing. And a lot of these conversations aren't research informed, and they aren't coming from a broad understanding of what happens for people who don't have a problem with this experience. People who don't have a problem with the experience of viewing pornography aren't getting online and proselytizing about it, trying to sell seminars to men about how it's okay.
Right.
People who have problems with this or who have had problems with this are trying to solve that problem, but are they applying the right tools with the right framework? Often, when we look at sexual behavior problems, there are other issues going on underneath that are unmanaged: depression, ADHD, OCD, and substance abuse addiction that might be contributing to those. And so to really understand that, for example, a client with OCD might come in really, really believing that their masturbation or porn viewing is a major problem for them, extremely torn up about it, believing that there's an intense moral quality to this. And then as the clinician, you begin getting into concrete specifics. How often do you do this? How is it damaging your experience? And there's no concrete relational connection. So it's not, their partner's fine with it. And the frequency of this habit is extremely low. It doesn't take place at inappropriate places or times. And it really is just a particular fixation of the OCD. But because it's sex, we get charged by it. We think, oh, sex is good or sex is bad. This kind of sex is the right kind of sex. That kind of sex is the wrong kind of sex. And all of this is true about pornography viewing too. So the research evidence about pornography viewing is that actually it helps men maintain erectile function throughout their lifespan, including erectile responsiveness in a relationship. And that the idea is that it causes erectile dysfunction, including in young men, may not be accurate. When I've worked with men who come in claiming that that's what's going on, what I most commonly find is that there's an erotic mismatch, that there's, for example, kink and vanilla discrepancy in their relationship. He's interested in more novelty, more practices, an open relationship, something like that. And because of that erotic discrepancy that he doesn't bring into his relationship, that he does express by viewing porn, it's easy to look at the porn and think the porn is the problem. The porn is really just mapping the internal erotic difference he already has, or has helped him to discover. And so when you talk about low motivation, I think that my experience of working with couples around that is nuanced because, yes, it's much easier. How many clicks would it take either of us to pull up an erotic image on our computer? Probably, I did this in this experiment once. I think I got it in less than 6, something like that. It was crazy how quick it can happen. It is easy to find that stimulus, and relationships are challenging. And just because a man goes to view pornography for self-stimulation doesn't mean that that's a reason that he doesn't talk about his sexuality, how to cultivate it, the emotional relational needs or barriers in the relationship that are causing the difficulties with the sexual connection. He doesn't have the tools to know about his feelings, to talk about and handle his partner's feelings. He doesn't have the communication tools for navigating the sexual consent process. That leads to an even greater difficulty in relationship. By contrast, porn is easy, but that doesn't mean that porn is the problem. A lack of consent, sex, communication, relationship, and emotion skills is the problem more often. So we go to blaming the sexual content so easily rather than looking at, for example, a lot of men do have problems with comparing porn to their real lives, but is it porn or is it we're not teaching men about real sex? So in my view, it's a lack of accurate sex education, including the emotional relational components of sex education, including the pleasure-oriented aspects of sex education that lead to that. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just listening. That makes sense. That's a very interesting take.
There are 2 great books that I can recommend to listeners around this. One is, they're both written by the same person. One is The Myth of Sex Addiction by David Ley. And the other one, also by David J. Ley, is, Ethical Porn for Dicks, A Man's Guide to Viewing Pleasure. And they address all of the concerns about this, including a number of the ones that you've raised. And he is, he's an expert witness. He's much more steeped in a research orientation as opposed to a clinical orientation than I am. And it's a big part of the reason that in my book, when I talk about this, I reference his book. He's written the definitive texts on it, in my experience thus far.
And honestly, I think that porn is one of the things that many men feel ashamed about. And I think hearing everything that you just said about it might help relieve that sense of shame. Wow, that's beautiful. um, Shame, that kind of leads me to the topic of guilt. And I wanted to make sure to bring that up today too. So I think a lot of what we're talking about can become very uncomfortable for men when it's easy to remember times when we did not practice consent, when we were unskillful, when we violated consent to whatever degree. And when you write things like that, pressure is on a continuum with rape, that makes us feel extremely uncomfortable. I mean, the fact that that is true, I think, makes us feel very uncomfortable. And yeah, I mean, it's just so difficult to talk about for many reasons. I mean, our own moral compass.
Yes.
This is one of the greatest violations that you could ever commit. Societally speaking, nothing will ostracize and demonize you faster than this crime. But yeah, when you kind of move away from the, rape end of that spectrum and toward just like manipulation or excess pressure, I'm sure most men can think of times that they regret.
Yeah,
and feel
exactly. I see fairly often a situation where a man in his relationship is unable to regulate his desire. When his partner says no, he experiences it as rejection and goes into this downward emotional spiral. Most men won't think of that as a kind of pressure, but most partners of men experience that as a kind of emotional blackmail. You can't manage your feelings for yourself, and therefore you're asking for access to my body for pleasure. You're not offering me anything. You're asking me for something. And the partner begins to know, if I don't do that, I got to sit with this sad sack for 3 days until either he resets on his own or I do finally get in the mode. And so I place this on that range of consent violations if you're unable to manage that yourself. And one of the things I really wanted to do in this book is to try to normalize this experience. This happens because we are given inaccurate descriptions of romantic myths. We're given inaccurate sexual myths. We're given inaccurate descriptions about how we work and who we are as men. We're given not enough tools for managing our emotions. And that's one of the reasons that as I was writing the book, I really felt that I needed to include an acknowledgement that I've made mistakes around this. I've done this kind of emotional pressure with my wife before I integrated aspects of my sexual identities. I cheated. I've misinterpreted partners in the past. I go into some of these experiences. I don't believe, I don't know of any of them to be at the level of predatory. And I'm also wanting to stay humble, trust the principles, trust the lessons that have come out of that experience. Let me share with you that we're in this together, that this is a common experience, that even well-intentioned, loving, kind people who want to be good make mistakes on this, and that a lot of those mistakes are not about who you are as a being, but about the tools that you didn't have and the traumas and wounds that have come to your heart that weren't your choice. And only you can attend to the fact that you didn't get that training. Only you can fill that gap. Only you can develop that skill. And because only you can, it is 100% your responsibility to do so. And I hope my book helps you with that process.
It's a powerful message. And I think your book truly does help with that. And I mean, it even had me thinking, like, I wonder what the youngest age would be that could really, that should read this book. I have a son who at this time is 10 years old, and gosh, it's like puberty is about to just rapidly change him, and he's about to be in the world of sexuality very soon. And I want to make sure that I'm offering him the best guidance possible. And this book is going to be a tool for that. But yeah, I mean, your expansion of what it means to be educated around sexuality is crucial. And I do think like consent should be part of our earliest sex education.
And a part of our earliest cultural education. You know, if we approach our children with a degree of acknowledgement of their physiological autonomy before we touch their bodies, wipe their faces, you know, do things with them, then we're inherently teaching them consent principles. There's a great book for younger audiences called, Sex, with a comma in it, that includes a lot of explicit lessons for children around consent. There are lots of great books out there for teaching children sex and consent education at developmentally appropriate ways at all stages of development. And I tend to think of my book as being more for adults, and I'm considering the possibility of writing another book that tries to address the parents' question of how do I teach this to the next generation. So,
yeah, well, let me know if you do.
All right.
Yeah. You started to talk about, you know, some of your own experiences, and I wanted to ask you more about that. I really appreciated that in the beginning, and then especially at the end of the book, you got personal with it. And like you said earlier in this conversation, this is not a finger wagging book. And I think part of how you make sure it's not is that you talk about your own experiences and the ways in which you fell short and didn't have the tools in the right moments. So I appreciate that so much. And, you know, you and I were both educated in the field of transpersonal psychology, which one of my big takeaways from being trained in that field was the emphasis on authenticity and the emphasis on, you know, whether you are the researcher or the clinician, recognizing your own subjectivity and the influence that that has on the process, and the importance of bringing in your own humanness to anything that you're discussing. And I just feel like you did that brilliantly and bravely in this book, and I appreciate it. And I think that gives, you know, other men the courage to talk about their own experiences as well, with guilt and with, you know, not having the right tools. So, you know, one of my questions, you say publicly, like in the about the author section, a little bit about your kind of setup, the nature of your relationship.
Yeah.
You say, you know, you're polyamorous, bisexual. You talk about, like you just said here, that, you know, you've had affairs. So I'm just wondering if you'll share with us a little bit about your personal process, your emotions, the conversations that were had, going from where you were before any of these changes were made to your circumstances, and before, as you put it, you integrated your own sexual identity, what that looked like before, and what that kind of fire of transformation looked like, and how you've gotten to this point now.
Sure. Well, you know, I guess I could start with, though I did get, I would say, explicit admonitions from the men in my life to get consent, I don't think that anybody ever really guided me in what that meant or how to do that. And in the sexual discovery process, feelings are so intense, and it's so easy to think that we are in flow together. And it's so easy to misinterpret a process or to think that we can move forward. And I've experienced that. I know that I thought that it was okay to move forward at times when it wasn't. And I got an abrupt, like, hey, you need to stop. Oh, okay. And I didn't intend to be in a situation of pressure. I don't think of myself, I don't want to be that kind of person, but I wasn't taught how to do that. And it took a journey of having some experiences with hard conversations with partners who said, hey, what happened there? Like, you were not in tune with me. And one of the things that came out of that process is really beginning to understand that, especially if I am partnering with a female partner, the pervasiveness of male sexual violence will have had an impact on that person. I think it's also true of men partnering with men, but we have a different framework, a little bit of a different response and orientation to it. It's not absent. But I had to learn that even if I want to be a good man, even if I have not done anything unsafe, scary, pushing or coercive with my partner is coming to me with a lifetime of other experiences that suggest to them that this is a perilous moment. It's pleasurable, but also a moment of concern. And once I really internalized that, I could begin to back up and really engage in a much more explicit consent process. That was probably in college by the time I really integrated that. But that still didn't mean that I integrated an understanding of like, hey, now I'm, out of college, I'm in grad school, I'm in a partnered relationship. I'm not experiencing the touch and the amount of sexual connection that I would like. How do I manage these emotions? I kept trying to talk about it. What's going on? Where's your desire? How can we get into it? And I thought I was being constructive, but what I was doing is putting more and more pressure onto the experience. If we don't have sex, we're going to have a talk about it. If we haven't had sex in a while, I'm going to be mopey. If we haven't had sex for a while, I'm going to think that there's something wrong with my partner. And it took me encountering concepts of differentiation that was developed by Virginia Satir and developed by David Schnarch, which is where I primarily encountered them, to begin to understand, hey, all those emotions and reactions that I was having, those are mine to manage. And it was really an affair, and witnessing the pain that caused to my wife at a vulnerable time in our lives that, just hit me in the gut. Like, I've got to learn this now. And unfortunately, I think that that's true for a lot of men, that it's the pain that we cause that calls us to develop. And, just frankly, I couldn't be in a situation where I was putting a book out like this and just relaying the tools, just relaying some of the integrated lessons from my biography and my clinical experience and the research that I've read about it, as if some of this didn't come at the expense of other people. It just wouldn't have been an integrity. And even then, right, I learned to manage my desire and my pleasure on my own, and I stopped pressuring my partner, and that brought us to a new chapter of our lives. But I still hadn't fully incorporated my polyamorous identity, my kink identity. I didn't know how to incorporate those. And, even though I really learned, wow, I clamped my desire down, I clamped my relational capacities down. And for 12 years, I didn't have an affair. But there was something that had split off for myself, something that I was denying for myself. Even once I learned what polyamory was and began kind of identifying with it and talking with my wife, it wasn't the time for us to begin having those conversations. And that discrepancy between living a life that wasn't authentic to me eventually caused me, I would say caused, because I hadn't integrated that, because I didn't know how to manage it better, I found myself against my own values and my own ethics and against my own lived experience having an affair again. And it was so frustrating for me as a person who thinks of myself most of the time as such an ethical person, such a rule follower, such a person who wants to be kind and conscientious, so much in tune with other people's well-being, to be doing this thing again that I know how much it hurts. And after that, I hurt not only my wife, but I have deeply hurt my affair partner. And I went through a long process with my wife of first repair and a reestablishment of our commitment and connection to each other. And then eventually reopening the conversation about what's authentic, what's possible for us. And fortunately, she is inherently a person with a low jealousy. Fortunately, a person who's very forgiving with a high level of grace. Fortunately, a person with maybe a little bit of a poly capacity herself. And so we were able to repair those wounds. And now I've been with my partner for 6.5 years. We celebrated a non-legal marriage, including that wove my wife into the ceremony. I live with both of them. And I guess, because I'm speaking so personally, let me just say to the listeners out there, whatever your authentic life of sexual integrity and health is, that is consent-based and causes no harm, it might be very different from mine. But I can just speak from this side of these difficult, painful journeys. It is so worth it. Don't wait to reclaim yourself. Don't wait to reintegrate the joy of your sexuality. This life is meant for your gifts, including your sexual gifts. They are beautiful. Find the way of bringing their beauty to the world. That's why I'm doing all of this. I'm not inherently an extrovert. Getting on social media this crazy way, I would not be doing this if it wasn't for you. Like the listener out there, I was tracing these developmental journeys with men so often in my office. I felt like I needed to get it out there for more people.
So, such a meaningful share. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Can I share with listeners where they can find me in the world?
Please.
So you can find me on social media at Dr. Eric Fitz, DRERICFITZ. I'm on TikTok, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel with all of my shorts that are posted elsewhere. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can find my website, also www.drericfitz.com. My links to my book are available there. And if you live in California, you could also potentially get in touch with me and see if I have availability in my practice.
Beautiful. And the name of your book, will you say the whole title and subtitle again?
Absolutely. The book is The Better Man, A Guide to Consent, Stronger Relationships, and Hotter Sex.
Congratulations on writing this book. I'm so inspired. I mean, you've always been an inspiration to me. And yet again, you're doing something that inspires me tremendously, both in writing this book and also in just kind of putting yourself out there into the world, in a way that's so courageous and honest and extremely helpful. I think this is what men need, is other men sharing like you're sharing and offering the insight that you're offering. And I just think as you emphasize, this kind of transformation starts within. The overcoming of this destructive form of masculinity starts within. And our emotional regulation and desire regulation is our own responsibility. And yet we need tools to take responsibility for this. So I appreciate that you are offering these tools. And I genuinely think this is going to make a big difference. So,
I hope so.
Yeah, I'll stay in touch with you through the journey, and I'll promote your book widely. I meet hundreds of new students every year, and so many of them are interested in topics like these. So I'll regularly recommend your book to them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we'll bring this conversation to a tentative close. I want to thank all the listeners, for listening and watching, and once again, my deepest appreciation for you, Dr. Eric FitzMedrud.
Thank you very much for having me here, Nick. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.